I'd settled into what looked like another quiet night at Tower 7. The coffee still hot in my thermos and the logbook spread open on the desk in front of me. 3 years of working these overnight shifts in Yellowstone's more remote areas had taught me to appreciate the predictable rhythm of radio checks, weather updates, and the occasional report of campers building fires too close to dry brush. The isolation never bothered me much. If anything, I preferred it to the chaos of the visitor centers during peak season. The tower sat 40 feet above the forest floor, giving me a clear view across miles of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir that stretched toward the park's eastern boundary. During the day, I could spot smoke from illegal campfires or track the movement of wildlife through the clearings. At night, the view turned into an ocean of darkness broken only by the occasional glint of moonlight on distant water. I was updating the evening's entries when the scream cut through the night. The sound hit me hard, raising every hair on my arms and sending an electric shock down my spine. In my 3 years working these isolated posts, I'd heard elk bugling during rut, the territorial calls of mountain lions, and the death cries of prey animals caught by predators. This was none of those things. The sound carried a human quality that made my stomach clench, but it was wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. Too long, too raw, filled with a terror that bounced off the trees long after the initial cry had ended. I dropped my pen and grabbed the radio, my training taking over even as my mind struggled to process what I'd just heard. "Base, this is Tower 7. I'm reporting a possible emergency situation." Sarah's voice came back crisp and professional, the way it always did during the night shift. "Tower 7, go ahead. I just heard what sounded like a human scream coming from the northwest quadrant, approximately 2 miles from my position, requesting immediate patrol response to investigate." "Copy that, Tower 7. Patrol units are being dispatched to your area. Maintain your position and continue monitoring. Do not leave your post." "Understood, Base." I set the radio down and moved to the northwest window, pressing my face against the glass as I looked around the tree line below. The forest looked exactly as it had 10 minutes earlier, dark, still, and giving away nothing. But something had changed out there, something that had made a person scream like their world was ending. The minutes crawled by with painful slowness. I checked my watch every few minutes, paced the small space of the tower cabin, and picked up the radio twice before setting it back down without calling. Sarah had been clear about staying put, and she was right to be. Tower protocol existed for good reasons, and I'd never been the type to go rogue just because my nerves were getting the better of me. But that scream kept playing in my head, and each time it did, my conviction about following orders weakened a little more. 20 minutes after my initial report, I radioed for an update. "Base, Tower 7, requesting status on the patrol response." "Tower 7, units are en route but encountering some difficulty with access roads in your sector. Continue monitoring and report any additional activity." Difficulty with access roads. That was dispatcher speak for, "It's going to take a while." The northwest quadrant was rough country, full of old logging trails that hadn't been kept up in years, and creek beds that turned into muddy traps after even light rain. If the patrol units were trying to get vehicles in there, they could be driving in circles for hours. I went back to the window and looked out at the darkness, trying to convince myself that whoever had screamed was probably already dead or had managed to get themselves to safety. Either way, there wasn't much I could do from up here except wait for the professionals to handle it. Another 20 minutes passed, then another. The silence from the forest felt heavy now, pressing down in a way that made me keep checking over my shoulder. I'd worked dozens of overnight shifts without feeling this worried, but something about tonight was different. The scream had marked a boundary, dividing the night into before and after, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened out there was still happening. At 1:15 in the morning, I made my decision. I gathered my gear the way I'd been trained to do before any backcountry expedition. LED flashlight with fresh batteries, backup flashlight clipped to my belt, handheld radio, first aid kit, emergency whistle, and my service knife. I checked the radio twice to make sure it was working, then wrote a detailed note explaining my actions and left it where Sarah or the patrol units would find it on the desk. Gone to investigate emergency situation reported at 0020 hours, Northwest Quadrant, approximately 2 miles from tower, radio contact maintained. Will report status every 30 minutes. Monsieur Walker, 0115. I locked the tower cabin, pocketed the key, and headed down the external stairs that wound around the tower's metal frame. The night air was cool against my face, carrying the scent of pine and the distant smell of a creek somewhere in the darkness. My boots rang against the metal steps, the sound bouncing off the surrounding trees in a way that made me wince. If anything was still out there, it would hear me coming from a mile away. But that scream had come from a human being, and even if the patrol units were on their way, they were clearly having trouble reaching the area. 3 years of working in wilderness rescue had taught me that the first hour after an emergency was often the most critical. If someone was hurt and bleeding out there in the dark, waiting for backup might mean the difference between a rescue and a body recovery. I reached the base of the tower and paused to get my bearings. The Northwest Quadrant stretched out before me, a maze of game trails and old fire roads that I knew better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. The scream had come from somewhere near Cedar Creek, where the terrain dropped into a series of small valleys that were popular with backcountry hikers. It was also an area where cell phone coverage was non-existent and where someone could easily get turned around if they were traveling at night. I turned on my flashlight and started walking, the beam cutting through the darkness ahead of me as I followed the main trail that would take me toward the creek. Behind me, Tower 7 rose like a skeletal finger against the star-filled sky, the cabin's windows reflecting my flashlight beam back at me until the trees closed in and blocked it from view. The forest felt different once I was inside it, the way it always did at night. During the day, these same trails were pleasant walks through postcard scenery. In the darkness, every shadow looked like something moving. Every snapping twig sounded like footsteps, and the spaces between the trees seemed to stretch on forever. I'd done plenty of night hiking during my training and in my early years as a ranger, but it never got completely comfortable. The darkness leveled the playing field between humans and everything else that lived out here. I walked steadily for 15 minutes, following the trail as it wound through stands of lodgepole pine and across a series of small clearings, where the moonlight provided enough light to navigate without the flashlight. The night sounds were normal. Wind moving through the trees, the distant call of an owl, the rustle of small animals moving through the plants. Whatever had caused that scream was either long gone or staying very quiet. The trail began to go down towards Cedar Creek, and I could hear the sound of running water somewhere ahead. This was the area where the scream had come from, and I slowed my pace as I looked around the darkness for any sign of human presence. Camping gear, abandoned backpacks, tracks in the soft earth near the creek, anything that might tell me what had happened out here. I was 20 minutes into my hike when I heard the first branch snap. The branch snap came from directly ahead, followed by the sound of something large moving through the bushes with no care for being quiet. I stopped walking and turned off my flashlight, letting my eyes adjust to the moonlight coming through the tree cover. Whatever was making that noise was coming toward me, crashing through plants in a way that suggested panic rather than hunting. I held the flashlight tighter and listened to the approaching noise. Branches snapped one after another, along with the clear sound of someone stumbling over roots and fallen logs. Human movement, definitely, but shaky and desperate. The person was moving fast but clumsily, like they were running from something in an area they couldn't see properly. The sounds got louder, and I heard heavy breathing mixed with what might have been crying. I clicked the flashlight back on and pointed the beam toward the noise, calling out in the firm voice I'd learned to use with lost hikers. "Hello, this is Ranger Walker with the National Park Service. Are you injured?" A figure burst through a cluster of young pines about 30 yards ahead, stumbling directly into my light beam. The person crashed to their knees, then struggled back to their feet, swaying badly. Even from a distance, I could see dark stains covering their clothes. I moved toward them quickly, but cautiously, keeping the flashlight trained on their face so I could see their expression. The guy looked young, maybe early 20s, with short brown hair and features that would probably be friendly under normal circumstances. Right now, his eyes were wide with terror, and his mouth hung open as he dragged air into his lungs in ragged gasps. "Hey, take it easy," I said, closing the distance between us. "I'm here to help. What's your name?" "Tyler," he managed between breaths. "Tyler Garcia. Oh God, we have to get out of here right now." I reached him and immediately understood why he was having trouble breathing. 4 parallel cuts ran diagonally across his chest, starting near his left shoulder and going down toward his ribs. The cuts had torn through his t-shirt and gone deep enough into the skin beneath that blood had soaked the fabric and was still flowing steadily. The wounds were too clean and too evenly spaced to be from any kind of accident. "Jesus, what happened to you?" I pulled out my radio with one hand while examining his injuries with the flashlight. "Base, this is Walker. I've found an injured hiker at my location. Male, early 20s, multiple lacerations to the chest. I need immediate medical evacuation." Tyler grabbed my arm with both hands, his fingers digging into my jacket sleeve. "No, you don't understand. It's still out there. It killed Michael, and it's coming for us. We have to run." "Slow down. Who's Michael? And what's still out there?" I tried to keep my voice calm while taking in more details about his condition. His left shoe was missing, and his sock was torn and bloody. Scratches covered his arms and face where he'd run through the trees. The kid was in shock, probably hypothermic, and losing blood at a rate that made me worry about how long he'd been running around out here. "My brother," Tyler said, his voice cracking. "We were camping by the creek, and this thing came out of nowhere. It grabbed Michael and just... God, the sounds he made. I tried to help him, but it was too strong, too fast. I ran, but it's been following me. It's been playing with me." Sarah's voice crackled through the radio. "Walker, medical evac will take at least 90 minutes to reach your coordinates. Can you move the victim to a closer extraction point?" Tyler heard the transmission and shook his head frantically. 90 minutes? We'll be dead in 90 minutes. That thing is hunting us. It knows where we are." I looked around at the dark forest surrounding us, trying to process what Tyler was telling me. Animal attacks were rare, but not unheard of in this part of Yellowstone. Mountain lions occasionally went after campers, and there had been a few grisly incidents over the years. But the wounds on Tyler's chest looked too precise, too deliberately placed, and his description of something hunting them suggested behavior that didn't match any predator I knew. "What kind of animal was it?" I asked, helping him lean against a tree trunk to take weight off his injured leg. "Bear? Mountain lion?" "It wasn't an animal," Tyler said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It was tall, maybe 7 feet, and thin like it hadn't eaten in months. But it moved wrong, like its joints were in the wrong places. And its face..." He trailed off, staring past me into the darkness. I followed his look but saw nothing except the normal shadows between the trees. "Tyler, you're in shock. Sometimes when people are traumatized, they don't remember things clearly. Why don't we focus on getting you medical attention, and then we can worry about..." A massive crash carried through the forest behind Tyler, the sound of something large hitting a tree trunk hard enough to shake the branches. Tyler spun around, lost his balance, and fell against me. I caught him with my free arm while swinging the flashlight toward the sound. "It found us," Tyler whispered. "Oh God, It found us. Another crash, closer this time, followed by the distinctive sound of wood splintering. Whatever was making that noise was moving in our direction with purpose, no longer concerned about stealth. I could hear branches breaking in a steady rhythm that suggested something large pushing through the bushes in a straight line. Tyler tried to stand up straighter, panic giving him a burst of energy. "Please, we have to run. It killed Michael, and it's going to kill us too. You have to believe me." The crashing sounds were getting closer, accompanied now by a low noise that might have been breathing, but was too deep and too rhythmic to come from any animal I recognized. I made a decision based on 3 years of wilderness experience and the absolute terror in Tyler's voice. "Okay, we're moving. Can you walk?" "I think so." I started to turn back toward the trail when something massive burst through the trees behind Tyler. In the split second before everything went wrong, my flashlight beam caught a glimpse of pale skin stretched over an impossibly tall body. The thing moved with a smooth motion that seemed to bend physics, covering the distance between the trees and Tyler in less time than it should have taken. Tyler opened his mouth to scream, but the sound cut off suddenly as something yanked him backward into the darkness beyond my light. The silence that followed lasted maybe 2 heartbeats before other sounds began. Sounds that my brain tried to label as falling branches or an animal feeding, but which my gut knew were something else entirely. The wet tearing noise came first, followed by the clear snap of bones breaking under pressure. Tyler made one more sound, a choked gasp that turned into something I'd never heard a human voice make before. Then, nothing except the continued sounds of destruction happening just outside the range of my flashlight. I stood completely still, every muscle in my body locked in place while my mind tried to process what had just happened. Tyler had been standing right next to me, talking about his dead brother and begging for help. Now he was gone, pulled into the darkness by something that had moved too fast for me to see clearly. The sounds stopped. The forest fell completely silent except for my own breathing, which seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet. I realized I was still holding the radio in one hand and the flashlight in the other, both pointed at the empty space where Tyler had been standing 30 seconds earlier. My survival instincts finally broke through the shock. I clicked off the flashlight and stood in the darkness, listening for any sound that might tell me where the thing had gone. Nothing. But I could feel it out there, watching me from somewhere just beyond the edge of perception. I took one careful step backward, then another, testing each step to make sure I didn't snap a branch or kick a rock. The trail back to Tower 7 stretched behind me through 2 miles of dark forest, but it was the only chance I had. Whatever had taken Tyler might still be hunting, and standing here in the open made me an easy target. I turned around and started walking back the way I'd come, moving as quietly as I could manage while fighting the urge to run. Behind me, the forest remained silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, staying just out of sight while I made my way home through the darkness. I climbed the metal stairs to Tower 7 faster than I'd ever moved before, my boots clanging against each step in a rhythm that matched my racing thoughts. Every few seconds I looked back at the tree line, expecting to see that pale figure come out from the shadows, but the forest stayed still. The radio crackled against my belt as I fumbled with the cabin keys, my hands shaking badly enough that it took 3 tries to get the door unlocked. Once inside, I slammed the door and immediately turned the deadbolt, then moved around the small space, checking every window latch. The tower cabin had been built for isolation and weather resistance, with thick log walls and heavy-duty hardware on all the openings. I tested each window lock twice, pulling on the frames to make sure they were secure. The space that had felt like a sanctuary for 3 years now felt like a trap 40 feet above the ground. I grabbed the radio and keyed it with more force than necessary. "Base, this is Walker. Emergency situation. I need immediate backup at Tower 7. Sarah's voice came back steady but concerned. "Walker, we have units en route to your last known position. What's your status?" "The hiker I found is dead. There's something else out here, something that killed him. I'm barricaded in the tower and I need armed backup now." A pause that lasted too long. "Walker, can you describe the threat?" I looked out the northwest window at the dark forest where Tyler had died less than an hour ago. How could I describe what I'd seen? The pale figure that moved wrong, the sounds Tyler had made as he was torn apart, the way the thing had appeared and disappeared like it was part of the darkness itself. Unknown animal, large, aggressive, and still in the area. How long until backup arrives? "Units are having difficulty with the access roads. Estimated arrival time is approximately 2 hours." 2 hours. I looked around the cabin at walls that suddenly didn't seem thick enough, at windows that felt too exposed. The creature had killed Tyler in seconds, moved faster than anything that size should have been able to move. But it was an animal, and animals couldn't climb metal towers. The height would keep me safe until help arrived. I pulled my service weapon from its holster and checked the magazine. 15 rounds of standard ammunition, which had never felt like such a small number before. I'd drawn the gun exactly twice in 3 years of ranger work, both times to scare off aggressive bears. Whatever had killed Tyler was no bear, but bullets were bullets. I set the weapon on the desk within easy reach and tried to settle into the routine of waiting. The radio stayed active with occasional check-ins from patrol units reporting their slow progress through the muddy back roads. I gave Sarah updates every 15 minutes, confirming my position and status while looking around the tree line for any sign of movement. The forest remained quiet. Normal night sounds gradually returned as the time stretched past 3 in the morning. The distant call of an owl, wind moving through the pine branches, the faint sound of Cedar Creek flowing somewhere in the darkness. Whatever had killed Tyler seemed to have moved on, maybe following some animal instinct to put distance between itself and the scene of its attack. I was starting to convince myself that the worst was over when I heard Tyler's voice. "Mason? Mason, are you up there?" The words drifted up from somewhere near the base of the tower, clear enough that I could make out every syllable. I moved to the window and peered down, but the shadows were too deep to see anything at ground level. "Mason, please help me. I got away, but I'm hurt bad. I need help." Every muscle in my body went tight. I'd watched Tyler die. I'd heard the sounds as something tore him apart just beyond the range of my flashlight. The voice calling my name from the darkness below belonged to a dead man. "I know you're up there, Mason. I can see the light in your window. Please, I'm bleeding and I can't make it much farther." The voice was wrong. It carried Tyler's words and tone, but something was missing. The emotion, the natural rhythm of human speech. It sounded flat, mechanical, like someone reading lines off a script without understanding what they meant. I picked up the radio, keeping my voice as quiet as possible. "Base, this is Walker. The threat has returned to my location. Do not send ground units. Repeat, do not send ground units until I give the all clear." "Copy, Walker. Are you secure in your position?" Before I could answer, something hit the base of the tower hard enough to make the entire structure shake. The impact came from directly below, followed by the sound of metal grinding against metal. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it down toward the base, but the beam couldn't reach through the darkness underneath the platform. Another impact, stronger this time. The whole tower swayed slightly, enough that I had to brace myself against the desk. Whatever was down there was testing the supports, checking for weak spots with careful precision. "Mason, why won't you help me? I thought we were friends." The voice had moved. Now it came from the opposite side of the tower, near the stairs I'd climbed 20 minutes earlier. But I hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't heard anything except the impacts against the support beams. A new sound started up, the screech of metal being bent under tremendous force. One of the tower's cross braces was giving way, the steel making noise as something twisted it beyond its design limits. I felt the floor tilt slightly to the left as the support structure began to fail. The thing wasn't just trying to get up to me, it was bringing the entire tower down. I grabbed my gear bag and the radio, shoving the flashlight and first aid kit inside while keeping the service weapon in my free hand. The tower shook again, and I heard the distinctive crack of a main support beam beginning to fail. The whole structure was going to collapse within minutes, taking me down with it unless I found another way out. The northwest window faced away from the stairs and offered a view of the forest cover about 15 feet below the cabin level. Pine branches thick enough to support my weight if I could reach them. I unlocked the window and pushed it open, cold night air rushing into the cabin along with the scent of pine needles and something else, a sweet, rotting smell that made my stomach turn. "You can't hide from me forever, Mason. I know where you are." Tyler's voice came from directly outside the window now, even though the ground was 40 feet below and there was nothing to climb on this side of the tower. I leaned out carefully and saw pale fingers wrapped around the window frame, attached to an arm that bent in too many places. The thing was climbing the outside wall of the tower, moving up the smooth log surface like it had claws or suction cups built into its skin. I didn't think. I just aimed the service weapon at those fingers and pulled the trigger. The gunshot exploded in the small space, leaving my ears ringing. The pale hand jerked away from the window, and I heard something large crash through the tree branches below. Black fluid splattered across the window frame where the fingers had been, thick and gooey like motor oil. I put away the weapon and climbed through the window without looking down, trusting my weight to a heavy pine branch that bent but held. The rough bark scraped against my jacket as I worked my way along the branch toward the tree trunk, moving as fast as I dared while listening for sounds of pursuit. Behind me, the tower cabin exploded inward with a crash of broken wood and shattered glass. Something roared with a sound like tearing metal, and I heard the systematic destruction of everything inside the cabin. Furniture turned over, equipment smashed, walls punched through with violent efficiency. I reached the tree trunk and half climbed, half fell to the forest floor, landing hard on my shoulder but keeping hold of my gear. The tower continued to shake and groan as the thing took out its rage on my former safe place, tearing apart the place where I'd spent 3 years of quiet nights. "Mason," Tyler's voice called from inside the ruined cabin, perfectly calm now. "Mason, where did you go? I just want to talk." I ran into the forest without looking back, following the trail by memory and moonlight while the sounds of destruction moved away behind me. Branches whipped across my face and my boots caught on hidden roots, but I kept moving deeper into the darkness, where something that wore a dead man's voice couldn't corner me 40 feet above the ground. The last thing I heard before the forest swallowed all other sounds was that horrible copied voice still calling my name, patient and stubborn as it searched through the wreckage of my former life. My boots hit the forest floor hard, catching on roots and loose rocks that I couldn't see in the dark. I'd been moving for what felt like hours, following game trails and old fire roads by memory and instinct, putting as much distance as possible between myself and the ruined tower. Every few minutes I clicked on the flashlight just long enough to get my bearings, then turned it off again before whatever was hunting me could track the light. The gear bag bounced against my back with each step, and my shoulder hurt where I'd hit the ground climbing out of the pine tree. Blood from the cuts on my face had dried and pulled at my skin when I moved my jaw. But I kept running because stopping meant thinking about what I'd seen, about Tyler's voice coming from something that definitely wasn't Tyler anymore. Branches hit my jacket and caught my sleeves as I pushed through stands of young lodgepole pine. The forest went on forever in all directions, mile after mile of wilderness that had felt like protection during my years of tower duty, but now seemed like a maze designed to trap me with whatever was following behind. I'd lost track of which direction I was heading, focused only on moving forward and the need to keep going until sunrise brought help or exhaustion made the choice for me. My legs started shaking somewhere around the 4th mile. The rush that had carried me through the tower collapse and the initial escape was wearing off, leaving behind the reality that I'd been running uphill through rough country for most of the night. My breathing came in harsh gasps that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest, and my vision started going spotty around the edges. I stumbled into a small clearing where moonlight came down through a gap in the trees, providing enough light to see fallen logs and scattered boulders. My left knee gave out without warning, sending me crashing against the trunk of a massive Douglas fir. I slid down the rough bark until I was sitting on the ground with my back pressed against the tree, chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The forest around the clearing was completely silent. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing except my own labored breathing and the distant whisper of water flowing somewhere in the darkness. I fumbled for my radio and pressed the button with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. Base. This is Walker. I'm approximately 6 miles northeast of Tower 7. Still mobile but need immediate backup. Static answered me. I tried again, adjusting the frequency, but got nothing except electronic snow. Either I was too far from the main communications array or something was interfering with the signal. Either way, I was on my own until I could reach higher ground or get closer to one of the relay stations scattered throughout this sector. I closed my eyes and focused on slowing my breathing, trying to ignore the way every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. The creature had destroyed my tower and chased me for miles, but it was still just an animal. Animals got tired, lost interest, moved on to easier prey. I just needed to stay hidden until morning brought search teams and enough daylight to make tracking easier. That's when I heard it moving through the trees. The sounds came from multiple directions at once, branches breaking to my left, footsteps circling around behind the clearing, the soft whisper of something large pushing through bushes. But the movement was wrong, too deliberate and too coordinated. Whatever was out there was taking its time, making sure I knew it was closing in. Mason? Tyler's voice drifted across the clearing from somewhere near the tree line, the same flat, emotionless tone I'd heard outside the tower window, but now I could hear something else underneath it. A wet, rasping quality, like someone talking with their mouth full of blood. Mason, why are you hiding from me? I thought we were going to help each other. I drew my service weapon and tried to track the voice, but it seemed to come from different locations each time. First from the trees directly ahead, then from my left, then from somewhere behind me that should have been impossible to reach without me hearing approach footsteps. I'm hurt, Mason. I need a friend to help me get home. The voice was getting closer, moving through the forest with the patient persistence of something that knew its prey was trapped. I pressed myself tighter against the tree trunk and tried to control my breathing, but every muscle in my body was locked with tension that made staying quiet almost impossible. Something stepped into the moonlight at the edge of the clearing. For a moment, my brain tried to process what I was seeing as Tyler. The same height, the same basic build, the same brown hair. But then the details started registering, and I understood why every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run. The thing standing 30 feet away was wearing Tyler like an ill-fitting costume, stretching his features across a frame that was fundamentally wrong. It stood almost 7 feet tall, though that height came from limbs that had been pulled and extended beyond human proportions, arms that hung down past its knees, attached to shoulders that were too narrow and positioned too high on its torso, legs that bent in too many places. giving it a stance that kept it balanced on the balls of its feet like it was ready to spring forward at any moment. The skin was the worst part. Tyler's face had been stretched across a skull that was the wrong shape, creating a permanent grin that split his features from ear to ear. The mouth was too wide and filled with teeth that started normal in front but became increasingly sharp toward the back, creating rows of points that caught the moonlight like broken glass. The eyes were Tyler's eyes, but they reflected light like an animal's, and they never blinked. "There you are," it said in Tyler's voice, though the words came out distorted by that massive grin. "I've been looking everywhere for you." The creature started walking toward me with a smooth motion that ignored normal joint limitations. Its arms swayed back and forth like pendulums, and its head tilted at an angle that would have broken a human neck. Every step was perfectly silent, its feet making no sound at all against the forest floor. I raised the service weapon with both hands, trying to get a clear sight picture while my whole body shook. "Stay back. Don't come any closer." The thing stopped about 15 feet away and tilted its head in the other direction, studying me with those unblinking eyes. "You don't need that gun, Mason. I'm your friend Tyler, remember? We met earlier tonight when you helped me with my injuries." It pointed toward its chest with one impossibly long arm, showing the torn fabric where I'd seen Tyler's real wounds. But underneath the ripped shirt, the skin was pale and unmarked, stretched tight over ribs that stuck out at sharp angles. "You're not Tyler," I said, surprised that my voice came out steady. "Tyler is dead." The grin got wider, pulling the stolen features into something that looked like it might split apart at any moment. Dead is such a limiting concept, don't you think? Tyler and I have become very close. We're sharing so much together now. It took another step forward, raising one hand toward me with fingers that were too long and had too many joints. The fingernails had grown into curved claws that looked sharp enough to slice through muscle and bone. "Don't you want to be close friends too, Mason? Don't you want to share what Tyler and I are sharing?" The gunshot exploded through the clearing like thunder, bouncing off the surrounding trees and leaving my ears ringing. The creature spun around as black fluid sprayed from its left shoulder, hitting the moonlit ground in a pattern that looked more like motor oil than blood. Another figure came out from the tree line behind the creature, rifle raised and aimed. The newcomer was human, definitely human, wearing ranger gear and moving with the controlled precision of someone who knew exactly what he was dealing with. The creature let out a sound that started as Tyler's voice screaming but became something else entirely. A metallic shriek like tearing steel that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. It spun toward the new threat, its injured arm hanging at an unnatural angle while black fluid continued to pour from the wound. The ranger fired again, the bullet catching the creature center mass and spinning it around. More of that thick black substance hit across the clearing, but the thing didn't go down. Instead, it gathered itself and jumped toward the tree line in a series of fluid leaps that covered impossible distances, disappearing into the darkness between one heartbeat and the next. The forest fell silent except for the ringing in my ears and the sound of spent brass hitting the ground. The ranger kept his rifle trained on the spot where the creature had vanished for a long moment before slowly lowering the weapon and turning toward me. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to taking charge in crisis situations. I holstered my service weapon and tried to stand up, my legs still shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. "Nothing serious. You?" "I'm fine. Name's Louis Johnson." He walked over and offered me his hand, helping me get steady on my feet. "I've been tracking that thing for months. Heard the gunshots from your tower and figured it had found someone else." Louis looked to be in his early 40s with the weathered features and alert posture of someone who'd spent years in the backcountry. His rifle was different from standard Park Service equipment. Longer barrel, heavier stock, and a scope that looked military grade. Whatever ammunition he was using had actually hurt the creature, something my service weapon couldn't do. "What the hell was that thing?" I asked, looking at the black stains scattered across the clearing where the creature's blood had hit the ground. Louis slung his rifle across his shoulder and checked his watch. "Something that shouldn't exist, but does anyway. We need to get you out of here before it decides to come back with friends." He pointed toward the eastern edge of the clearing where I could make out what might have been a trail leading downhill. "My truck's about 2 miles that way. You up for a walk, or do I need to carry you?" I shouldered my gear bag and tested my legs. They were still shaky but functional. "I can make it, but I want answers. I want to know what killed Tyler and why it was wearing his face." Louis nodded and started walking toward the trail. "You'll get your answers, but not here, and not while that thing is still hunting. Let's move." I followed him into the trees, leaving behind the clearing where something impossible had tried to kill me with a dead man's voice. Behind us, the black stains on the ground slowly began to smoke in the moonlight, dissolving into vapor that smelled like copper and decay. Louis started moving the moment the creature's sounds faded into the distance, waving for me to follow him toward the eastern edge of the clearing. I shouldered my gear bag and fell into step behind him, my legs still unsteady but functional enough to keep up. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent years walking through wilderness at night, testing each step before putting his full weight down while keeping his rifle ready across his chest. We walked in silence for the first half-mile, following what might have been an old game trail that wound between massive Douglas firs and stands of lodgepole pine. Louis stopped every few minutes to listen, his head tilted toward the surrounding forest while his eyes looked around the shadows between the trees. The creature could still be out there, wounded and angry, waiting for another chance to finish what it had started. My shoulder hurt where I'd hit the ground climbing out of the pine tree, and the cuts on my face had started bleeding again from walking uphill through rough terrain. But the pain helped keep me focused, gave me something concrete to think about, instead of the memory of Tyler's stretched features and that horrible grin full of sharp teeth. "How long have you been tracking it?" I asked when we reached a small creek that burbled invisibly in the darkness. Louis stopped at the water's edge, looking both directions before stepping across on a fallen log. 3 years, ever since it killed my partner in Glacier National Park." He said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather, but I caught the tightness around his eyes when he mentioned his partner. 3 years of hunting something that had already taken someone important to him. 3 years of nights like this one, moving through dark forests with modified weapons and ammunition that most people didn't know existed. "The missing campers you mentioned," I said, following him across the log. "How many?" 6 people in the last month. 3 separate incidents, all in remote areas of the park. We found what was left of the first group about 2 weeks ago." Louis adjusted his rifle strap and kept walking. That's when I knew it was here. The trail began going down through a series of switchbacks that took us deeper into a narrow valley. I could hear running water somewhere ahead, and the air carried the smell of wet earth and rotting leaves. Normal forest smells that should have been comforting but now seemed threatening, like they might be hiding something worse underneath. "Your ammunition," I said. "It actually hurt the thing. My service weapon didn't even slow it down." Louis reached into his jacket and pulled out a brass cartridge, holding it up so I could see it in the moonlight. The bullet looked similar to standard rifle ammunition, but with a slightly different color to the metal and strange markings etched around the base. "Custom load. Took us 2 years to develop something that would penetrate its hide and actually cause damage." He pocketed the cartridge and kept walking. "Even then, it's not enough to kill it. Just hurts it enough to make it retreat and rethink its approach." We walked for another 20 minutes before I saw light coming through the trees ahead. Louis had parked his truck on what looked like an old maintenance road, the kind of forgotten access route that Park Service used for equipment transport before better roads were built. The vehicle was a modified Ford F-250 with a heavy-duty brush guard and oversized tires designed for backcountry travel. Louis unlocked the passenger door and waited while I climbed inside, then secured his rifle in a rack mounted behind the seats. The truck's interior was cleaner than I'd expected, with none of the accumulated gear and paperwork that usually filled Ranger vehicles. Instead, everything looked purposeful and organized, like this was a tool designed for a specific job rather than general patrol work. "Hospital's about 40 minutes from here," Louis said, starting the engine. "We need to get those cuts looked at, and you're probably dehydrated." The truck pulled onto the maintenance road with a quiet rumble, headlights cutting through the darkness ahead of us. Louis drove carefully but steadily, navigating the rough surface like someone who'd traveled this route before. I sat back against the seat and tried to process everything that had happened since I'd heard Tyler's scream from the tower. "The creature," I said. "What exactly is it?" Louis was quiet for a long moment, his hands steady on the steering wheel as we went through a series of potholes filled with muddy water. "We don't know. Not exactly. The researcher on our team has theories, but nothing definitive. What we do know is that it's intelligent, it's adaptable, and it's been killing people across the western United States for at least 10 years. He turned onto a paved road that would take us toward Jackson, the truck's headlights finally able to reach full effectiveness on the smooth surface. It hunts in cycles, shows up in an area, kills for a few weeks or months, then moves on. Sometimes it comes back to the same place years later, sometimes never." "How many people?" I asked. "We've confirmed 15 kills across 7 states, but that's just the ones we can prove. The real number is probably much higher." Louis glanced at me in the dim light from the dashboard. "Most of the time, the deaths get explained away. Animal attacks, accidents, missing persons who supposedly wandered off and died of exposure. The Park Service and federal authorities prefer it that way." The truck crested a hill, and I could see lights in the distance marking the outskirts of Jackson. Normal lights from normal buildings where normal people were sleeping peacefully, unaware that something impossible was hunting in the wilderness just outside their comfortable world. "There's a cover-up," I said. It wasn't a question. "Has to be. Can you imagine what would happen if people knew the truth? Every national park in the country would empty overnight. The entire outdoor recreation industry would collapse. Billions of dollars in lost revenue, millions of jobs gone." Louis turned onto the main highway leading into town. "So they classify everything, explain away the deaths, and rely on people like us to keep the threat contained." "People like us?" "Rangers, federal agents, researchers, 8 people total spread across 7 states. We track it, we document its movements, and when we get lucky, we hurt it enough to make it move on." His voice carried a bitter edge. "We don't kill it, though. That's beyond our current capabilities." We drove through the quiet streets of Jackson in silence, past darkened shops and restaurants that catered to tourists who came to experience the beauty of the wilderness. None of them would be back if they knew what was really out there, what had been hunting in their vacation paradise for over a decade. St. John's Medical Center sat on the northern edge of town, a modern building that looked reassuringly normal after the night I'd had. Louis pulled into the emergency room parking lot and turned off the engine. "What do I tell them?" I asked. "The truth, mostly. You encountered an aggressive animal that destroyed your cabin. You were forced to evacuate and spent several hours walking through rough terrain in the dark. The cuts on your face are from branches and you're dehydrated and exhausted." Louis opened his door and stepped out. "I'll handle the paperwork and talk to the sheriff's department." The emergency room was bright and clean and filled with normal medical smells that made everything feel real again. A nurse named Jennifer took my vitals and brought me to an examination room where Dr. Martinez spent 30 minutes cleaning the cuts on my face and checking me for signs of concussion. The questions were routine medical questions about my symptoms and recent activities, and I stuck to Lewis's suggested story about an animal encounter and nighttime evacuation. They kept me for observation and IV fluids to address the dehydration, setting me up in a private room that looked out over the parking lot. Through the window, I could see Lewis's truck parked under a street light, and occasionally I caught sight of him walking between the building and his vehicle as he handled whatever official business needed to be managed. I must have dozed off sometime after sunrise because the next thing I knew, Louis was sitting in the chair beside my bed. The room was dim, with late afternoon light coming through partially closed blinds. A look at the wall clock showed it was almost 7 in the evening. "How long was I out?" I asked, my throat dry and scratchy. "About 8 hours. Doctor says you can go home tomorrow morning if your levels stay stable." Lewis leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious. "I talked to the Sheriff's Department and the Park Service Administration. The official story is that a grizzly bear destroyed Tower 7 and killed the Garcia brothers. You encountered the same animal and were forced to evacuate your position." I sat up straighter in the hospital bed. "The Garcia brothers?" "Search teams found Tyler and Michael's bodies this morning, about 5 miles from your tower. Camped illegally in a restricted area." Lewis pulled a manila folder from his jacket and set it on the bedside table. "The wounds are consistent with our creature, but they'll be attributed to the bear attack." The folder contained crime scene photographs that I wasn't sure I wanted to see, but I opened it anyway. The images showed 2 young men who had died violently in their campsite near a small creek. The damage was extensive and obviously not caused by any normal animal, but I could see how it might be explained away to people who didn't know what to look for. "This happens everywhere it goes," Lewis said. "Death gets covered up, families get explanations that make sense, and life goes on, except for the people who know the truth." I closed the folder and handed it back to him. "How do you live with it, knowing this thing is out there killing people and you can't stop it?" Louis took the folder and stood up from his chair, walking to the window that looked out at the parking lot. "You learn to focus on what you can do instead of what you can't. We can't kill it, but we can track it. We can be ready when it shows up somewhere new. We can hurt it enough to make it move on before it kills too many people." He turned back toward me, his face showing the burden of 3 years spent hunting something that couldn't be caught. "The question is whether you can live with knowing the truth and going back to your normal job like nothing happened. Because that's one option. Transfer to a different park, maybe take a desk job somewhere safe, and try to forget what you saw tonight." I thought about Tyler's final moments, about the sound of his voice coming from something that wore his face like a mask. I thought about the 6 missing campers Lewis had mentioned, and about how many other people were out there right now setting up camps in remote areas where something impossible might be hunting. "What's the other option?" I asked. Lewis smiled for the first time since I'd met him, a look that carried more determination than humor. "You join our little group and help us hunt the thing that killed Tyler Garcia. It's dangerous work that officially doesn't exist, but it's the only way to prevent more deaths like the ones you saw tonight." He walked back to the chair and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I won't lie to you, Mason. The work is hard, the resources are limited, and the creature is smart enough to stay ahead of us most of the time. But people like you, rangers with field experience who know how to handle themselves in the wilderness, that's what we need if we're going to have any chance of protecting the people who don't know what's out there." I looked at the ceiling tiles and listened to the normal sounds of hospital activity in the hallway outside my room. Doctors making rounds, nurses checking on patients, families visiting their loved ones who were recovering from normal injuries and illnesses. A world where the biggest dangers were accidents and disease. Not creatures that stole faces and copied voices of the dead. But I also thought about Tyler, about how he died trying to warn me about something that shouldn't exist, about Michael Garcia, who'd never had a chance to run, about the 6 missing campers and the 15 confirmed kills across 7 states and all the deaths that had been covered up and explained away over the past decade. The creature, I said. Is it still out there? Yes, wounded but alive. It'll probably move to a different area to heal, then start hunting again somewhere else. Louis stood up and moved toward the door. I'm going to let you get some rest. Think about what I said, and we'll talk tomorrow. He paused in the doorway and looked back at me. For what it's worth, you handled yourself well tonight. Tyler Garcia might be dead, but you're alive, because you made the right choices when it counted. That's not something everyone can do when they're face to face with something impossible. After he left, I lay in the hospital bed and stared out the window at the mountains surrounding Jackson. Somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness that had been my home and workplace for 3 years, something was hunting people who had no idea they were in danger. Something that wore human faces and spoke with human voices and killed with inhuman precision. Tomorrow I would have to choose between the safety of ignorance and the burden of knowledge, between a normal life that felt like a lie and a dangerous truth that might be the only way to save the next Tyler Garcia from dying alone in the darkness. The choice, I realized, had already been made the moment I heard Tyler's scream from Tower 7. I just hadn't admitted it to myself yet. I'd been staring at the same page of a magazine for 20 minutes when Louis knocked on the hospital room door. The words kept blurring together every time I tried to focus, my mind pulling me back to the clearing where something impossible had worn Tyler's face like a mask. 2 days of IV fluids and observation had cleared the dehydration and treated the cuts, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that wet, rasping quality underneath Tyler's stolen voice. Louis entered, carrying a manila folder and a cup of coffee that smelled strong enough to wake the dead. He looked like he hadn't slept much either, dark circles under his eyes and the kind of stubble that suggested he'd been working around the clock since our encounter in the forest. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling into the visitor's chair beside my bed. Like I got hit by a truck and then chased through the woods by something that shouldn't exist. I set the magazine aside and watched him arrange the folder on the bedside table. "Please tell me you have good news." Louis opened the folder and pulled out a stack of photographs, handling them with the careful way of someone who'd seen too many crime scenes. Search teams found the Garcia brothers this morning. Campsite was about 5 miles northwest of your tower, right along Cedar Creek, where you heard the original scream. He handed me the first photograph, and I had to force myself to look at it properly. Tyler and Michael Garcia had died at what appeared to be a well-established campsite, complete with a fire ring and cleared sleeping area that suggested they'd been there for several days. Their tent was torn apart, gear thrown across a 20-foot radius like someone had exploded a bomb inside their camp. The second photograph showed the bodies themselves, and I understood immediately why Louis had been reluctant to share these images. Both brothers had wounds that were surgical in how precise they were, long parallel cuts that went deep enough to show bone in some places. The spacing was too regular, and the angles too planned for any animal I'd ever seen. "Official cause of death?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be insufficient. "Grizzly bear attack. Single adult male, estimated weight between 400 and 500 pounds. Louis pulled out another photograph that showed claw marks on a nearby tree trunk. Sheriff's Department found tracks and scat that support the theory, plus hair samples caught on broken branches. I studied the tree damage more carefully. The claw marks were deep and spaced like a large bear might leave, but something about the pattern bothered me. The scratches were too uniform, like someone had measured the distance between each gouge to make sure they were consistent. The creature planted evidence, I said. That's our working theory. It's intelligent enough to understand how human investigators process crime scenes, and it's been refining its cover-up techniques for years. Louis retrieved the photographs and arranged them in chronological order, based on the evidence markers visible in each image. This isn't the first time we've seen staged bear sign at one of its kill sites. The implications hit me like cold water. An animal that could mimic human voices and wear human faces was disturbing enough, but one that understood forensic investigation and could manipulate physical evidence suggested a level of intelligence that made it exponentially more dangerous. Tyler and Michael were camping illegally, Lewis continued, pulling out a Park Service map marked with red X's. This whole section has been restricted to overnight camping for the past 18 months, ever since we started seeing unusual activity in the area. The map showed the restricted zone covering roughly 30 square miles of wilderness around Cedar Creek and the surrounding drainage basins. 3 additional red marks indicated locations where other incidents had occurred, forming a rough triangle with Tyler and Michael's campsite at the center. Other disappearances? I asked. 3 people over the past year. Solo hiker named Jennifer Walsh last October disappeared about 2 miles upstream from where we found the Garcia brothers. Couple from Denver named the Hendersons vanished in March while on an anniversary camping trip. We found their gear but never recovered the bodies. Louis traced the locations with his finger, showing how they formed a pattern around the same general area. All of them were experienced outdoors people who knew the risks and followed proper safety protocols. I thought about Tyler's final moments, how the creature had tracked him through miles of forest before finally cornering him in that clearing. The idea that it had been hunting in this area for over a year, picking off isolated targets while leaving just enough evidence to maintain plausible cover stories, made my skin crawl. How long has this been going on? I asked. Not just here, but everywhere. Louis closed the map and leaned back in his chair, looking tired and worn down. We've been tracking confirmed kills for the past decade, but there are reports going back much further that fit the pattern. The creature seems to hunt in cycles, shows up in an area, kills for several weeks or months, then disappears completely. Sometimes it comes back to the same location years later, sometimes never. He opened a different section of the folder and pulled out a summary sheet covered with locations, dates, and victim counts. The data stretched across 7 western states, from Washington down to Arizona, with clusters of activity that moved in no predictable pattern. 15 confirmed kills that we can definitively attribute to the creature, Louis said, but that's just cases where we had direct involvement or access to evidence that couldn't be explained away. The real number is probably 3 or 4 times higher. I scanned the list of locations and dates, recognizing several national parks and wilderness areas where I'd worked or spent time. Places that had seemed safe and familiar now carried the knowledge that something predatory had moved through them, hunting people who'd come seeking peace and recreation in nature. The cover-up, I said. How high does it go? High enough. Park Service Administration, FBI, couple of senators who sit on the appropriate committees. The official position is that public knowledge would cause mass panic and destroy the outdoor recreation industry overnight. Lewis retrieved the summary sheet and returned it to the folder. Think about it. Every national park in the country would empty out if people knew something like this was hunting campers and hikers. Billions in lost tourism revenue, millions of jobs gone, entire communities that depend on outdoor recreation would collapse. The logic was harsh, but undeniable. The American economy had woven outdoor recreation so deeply into its fabric that acknowledging an apex predator in the wilderness would trigger consequences far beyond the immediate threat to human life. Better to lose a few dozen people per year than risk societal and economic upheaval on a massive scale. So they just let it keep killing people. They let us try to contain it, 8-person task force spread across 7 states, operating with minimal resources and questionable authority. We track its movements, document its behavior, and try to be in position when it shows up somewhere new. Louis's voice carried a bitter edge that spoke to years of bureaucratic frustration. When we're lucky, we hurt it enough to make it move on before the body count gets too high. I thought about the ammunition he'd used in the clearing, how the creature had actually reacted to being shot with something other than standard rounds. The idea that a handful of people with modified weapons were the only thing standing between this monster and countless innocent victims seemed both noble and hopeless. "The creature," I said. "How intelligent is it really?" Louis was quiet for a moment, thinking carefully about his answer. "Smart enough to stay away from areas with lots of cops. It never hunts near big cities or popular tourist spots where people going missing would get too much attention. It goes after people alone or small groups in remote areas where deaths can look like accidents or just bad luck." He pointed toward the crime scene photos. "It gets how we look into deaths and how to leave evidence that supports other explanations. It knows enough about how people act to copy voices and behavior well. And it learns. Every time we come up with new tactics or equipment, it changes its own methods to work around them." The hospital room felt smaller as what we were dealing with hit me. This wasn't just a dangerous animal that sometimes killed people in the woods. It was a smart predator that had studied human society well enough to use our weak spots and problems against us, turning our own investigation methods around while keeping a hunting pattern that could go on forever. A nurse knocked on the door and came in to check my IV and vitals, reminding me that normal life kept going outside this talk about impossible things. She asked how I was feeling, checked my fluid levels, and said Dr. Martinez would come by for evening rounds. Professional medical care in a clean, well-lit place where the biggest dangers were infection and medication errors. After she left, Louis gathered the photos and closed the folder. "I'm going to let you get some rest. Tomorrow we'll talk about what comes next." What comes next? You have choices to make. The Park Service will offer you a transfer if you want it. Desk job in Denver, maybe something in administration where you won't have to think about what's out there in the wilderness. Louis stood up and moved toward the door. "Or you can join our little group and help us hunt the thing that killed Tyler Garcia." He paused in the doorway, looking back at me with an expression that mixed hope and resignation. "Either way, you'll never be able to forget what you've seen. The question is whether you want to live with that knowledge passively or do something about it." After he left, I lay in the hospital bed and stared out the window at the mountains that surrounded Jackson. The peaks looked the same as they had 3 days ago before I'd learned about creatures that wore human faces and government conspiracies that buried inconvenient truths. But now I understood that those ridges and valleys hid something that had been hunting people for over a decade. Something that could be anywhere at any time. Somewhere out there, the creature was healing from the wounds Louis had given it, probably already planning its next move to a new hunting ground where fresh victims waited unknowingly. And somewhere else, 8 people with modified weapons and limited resources were trying to track an intelligent predator across millions of acres of wilderness, racing against time and bureaucracy to prevent the next Tyler Garcia from dying alone in the darkness. The choice Louis had offered wasn't really a choice at all. I'd already made my decision the moment I heard Tyler's scream from Tower 7. I just hadn't realized it yet. Tomorrow I would tell Louis I was ready to join the hunt, ready to trade the illusion of safety for the burden of truth. Because some knowledge, once gained, demanded action rather than acceptance. I signed the last discharge form with handwriting that looked steadier than I felt, the pen scratching across hospital paperwork that reduced 3 days of medical observation to a series of checkboxes and official signatures. Dr. Martinez had cleared me for light duty with instructions to follow up if the headaches returned, and the nurse at the desk handed me a plastic bag containing the clothes I'd worn into the emergency room, torn, blood-stained, and smelling faintly of antiseptic. The Park Service had arranged temporary housing at a small complex on the outskirts of Jackson, the kind of furnished apartments they kept for seasonal workers and rangers between permanent assignments. The unit was clean and functional, with generic furniture and a view of the parking lot that felt deliberately unremarkable. I dropped my gear bag on the single bed and stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by beige walls and rental-grade appliances that belonged to no one. My supervisor had called twice while I was in the hospital, offering condolences about the tower incident and mentioning a possible transfer opportunity. The Denver regional office had an opening in resource management, desk work, regular hours, no overnight assignments in remote locations. Safe work for someone who'd been through a traumatic experience with dangerous wildlife. I walked to the kitchenette and opened the refrigerator, finding it stocked with basic supplies that some administrative assistant had arranged. Milk, bread, sandwich meat, and a six-pack of beer that suggested someone understood what I might need after 3 days of hospital food and IV drips. I opened one of the bottles and sat on the couch, staring at the television that remained turned off. Sleep had been the biggest problem during my stay at St. John's. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Tyler's voice calling my name from outside the tower, that flat, emotionless tone that copied human speech, without understanding human emotion. The nursing staff had offered sleeping pills, but pharmaceutical unconsciousness felt like giving up control to something I wasn't ready to let go of. The nightmares were worse than simple fear. In them, Tyler stood at the edge of clearings or outside windows, wearing that impossible grin while his stretched features asked why I hadn't helped him, why I'd let him die alone in the darkness. Sometimes the dream Tyler would remove his face like a mask, showing something underneath that was too horrible to remember clearly upon waking. But alongside the horror, I'd discovered something unexpected. Anger. Not the helpless rage of trauma, but a focused fury directed at the thing that had killed Tyler Garcia and Michael Garcia and 15 other people across 7 states. The creature had been hunting for over a decade, while bureaucrats classified the deaths and families received explanations that made everything seem like tragic accidents or bad luck. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mind if I stop by? We should talk. Louis." I texted back my address and apartment number, then spent the next 20 minutes pacing between the kitchen and living room while trying to organize my thoughts. Louis had saved my life in that clearing, but he'd also opened my eyes to a reality that made the world feel fundamentally different. Knowledge that couldn't be unknown, truth that demanded some kind of response. When Louis knocked on the door, I found him looking as tired as I felt. He carried a manila folder and a paper bag that smelled like Chinese takeout. Practical items that suggested he'd come prepared for a long conversation. "How are you holding up?" he asked, settling onto the couch while I cleared space on the coffee table for the food containers. Better than I expected, worse than I hoped. I opened the bag and found enough food for both of us, realizing I hadn't eaten anything substantial since breakfast. The nightmares are rough, but I'm dealing with them. Louis handed me a container of fried rice and kept the kung pao chicken for himself. Nightmares are normal after what you went through. Most people who run into the creature and survive end up with some form of PTSD. The ones who don't get help usually end up drinking too much or taking unnecessary risks in the field. And the ones who do seek help? They learn to channel the trauma into something productive, like joining a task force that hunts the thing that gave them nightmares in the first place. Louis opened his container and started eating, his matter-of-fact tone suggesting this conversation was a familiar one. "Your supervisor called me about the Denver transfer offer. Desk job in resource management, good benefits, minimal field work." I ate in silence for a few minutes, thinking about fluorescent lights and filing cabinets and budget meetings that dealt with theoretical resources rather than actual wilderness. Safe work that would pay the bills and provide health insurance, while keeping me away from remote areas where impossible things hunted campers. It's a good offer, Louis continued. Chance to start over somewhere new, away from reminders of what happened here. A lot of people would take it without thinking twice. But you don't think I should? Louis set down his chopsticks and looked at me directly. I think you should do whatever lets you sleep at night. But I also think you understand something most people don't, that there's a monster out there killing innocent people, and only a handful of us know enough to do anything about it. He opened the manila folder and pulled out a photograph showing a family of 4 standing beside a camping tent. Parents in their 30s with 2 young children, all smiling at the camera with the kind of happiness that came from shared adventures in beautiful places. The Henderson family disappeared in March during an anniversary camping trip near Cedar Creek, about 2 miles from where we found the Garcia brothers. Louis placed the photograph on the coffee table between us. Park Service found their campsite but never recovered the bodies. Official explanation was that they got lost during a hike and died of exposure. The second photograph showed the Hendersons' abandoned campsite, tent still standing but gear scattered in the same deliberate pattern I'd seen in the Garcia crime scene photos. The precision of destruction that suggested intelligence rather than random animal behavior. The creature had been hunting in your area for months before it killed Tyler and Michael, Louis said. 3 confirmed victims, plus who knows how many others who just vanished without leaving enough evidence to investigate properly. I studied the family photograph, thinking about 2 children who'd gone camping with their parents and never come home. About how their deaths had been explained away as navigation errors and bad weather while the real killer moved on to hunt somewhere else. How many people are in your task force? I asked. 8 total. 4 park rangers, 2 FBI agents, 1 fish and wildlife investigator, and a researcher from the University of Montana who's been studying similar entities for 20 years. Louis retrieved the photographs and returned them to the folder. We operate with minimal official support and questionable authority, but we're the only people with the knowledge and resources to track this thing. Similar entities? Dr. Sarah Chen, our researcher, believes there might be more than one creature, different species or subspecies maybe, with slightly different hunting patterns and physical characteristics. Louis finished his food and leaned back on the couch. She's the one who developed the ammunition that can actually hurt them. Without her work, we'd still be shooting regular bullets that bounce off like spitballs. The idea that multiple creatures might be hunting across the American wilderness was almost too much to handle. One smart predator that could copy human voices and plant fake evidence was scary enough. A whole group of these things meant a threat so big that government cover-ups almost made sense. The work, I said, what would it actually involve? Tracking, surveillance, response to incidents like the one you experienced. We monitor missing persons reports, unusual animal behavior, and patterns that suggest creature activity. When we identify a likely hunting ground, we deploy resources to the area and try to locate it before the body count gets too high. Louis's expression grew more serious. Sometimes we succeed in wounding it enough to make it relocate. Sometimes we arrive too late and just document another crime scene. And sometimes people like you encounter it unexpectedly and have to make split-second decisions that determine whether they live or die. Louis stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had been his hunting ground for 3 years. You handled yourself well in that clearing, Mason. You kept your head when most people would have panicked, and you made choices that kept you alive long enough for backup to arrive. I thought about those terrifying minutes when the creature had circled my position, speaking in Tyler's stolen voice while I pressed against the tree trunk with my service weapon drawn. The decisions had felt desperate and improvised at the time, but maybe they'd been better than I'd realized. What kind of training would be involved? I asked. Couple weeks of intensive preparation, recognition of creature sign, specialized weapons training, tactical communication protocols, and psychological conditioning to help you function when encountering something that shouldn't exist. Louis turned back toward me, his expression hopeful but patient. The work is dangerous and it's officially classified, but it's also the most important thing any of us has ever done. Because no one else knows the truth. Because no one else can know the truth. Can you imagine what would happen if word got out about intelligent predators hunting in our national parks? Every wilderness area in the country would empty overnight. The entire outdoor recreation industry would collapse, taking millions of jobs and billions in economic activity with it. Louis sat back down on the couch, his voice carrying the weight of years spent carrying terrible knowledge. So we do the work quietly, without recognition or official support, because it's the only way to protect both the victims and the society that depends on never knowing they exist. I finished my food and set the container aside, thinking about Tyler's final moments and the sound his voice had made coming from something that wore his face, about the Garcia brothers who'd just wanted to go camping, and the Henderson family who'd planned an anniversary celebration in the wilderness, and all the other victims whose deaths had been explained away as accidents or bad luck. The creature, I said. Is it still in the area? No. Our tracking suggests it moved north after the encounter in the clearing, probably heading toward Glacier National Park, following its typical pattern of hunting for a few weeks before relocating to avoid detection. Louis collected the empty food containers and put them back in the paper bag. Which means there are fresh potential victims in a new hunting ground, people who have no idea something impossible is moving through their wilderness. The anger I'd been carrying since the hospital flared stronger, focused now on the knowledge that the creature was already selecting new targets while I sat in temporary housing debating career options. Somewhere, people were planning camping trips and hiking adventures in areas that looked safe on maps, but contained an apex predator that understood human psychology well enough to exploit our blind spots. If I join your task force, I said, what happens to my official position with the Park Service? You'd be transferred to roving patrol duties that provide cover for task force operations. On paper, you're conducting routine wilderness checks and interagency coordination. In reality, you're tracking a monster that kills people. Louis stood up and moved toward the door, giving me space to process the decision. Think about it tonight. I'll be in town through tomorrow if you want to talk more. After he left, I sat in the quiet apartment and tried to imagine returning to normal ranger duties, doing campground checks, helping lost hikers, writing reports about bear encounters and trail maintenance needs. Useful work that served the public while ignoring the knowledge that something far more dangerous than bears was hunting in areas where I might send families for safe camping experiences. The alternative was joining a secret task force that fought creatures which shouldn't exist. Work that was dangerous and officially didn't happen, but might be the only thing preventing more deaths like Tyler's. Trading the illusion of safety for the burden of truth, accepting responsibility for knowledge that couldn't be unknown. I opened another beer and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains where the creature had hunted for months before I'd run into it in that clearing. Tyler Garcia had died trying to warn me about something impossible. And now I had to decide whether his death would mean something or just become another covered-up tragedy in a long chain of official lies. The choice, I figured out, had been made 3 nights ago when I'd heard Tyler's scream from Tower 7. Everything since then had just been the process of accepting what I'd already decided in that moment when I'd left my post to investigate an emergency in the wilderness. Some knowledge demanded action rather than acceptance, and some responsibilities couldn't be transferred to someone else. Tomorrow I would tell Louis I was ready to join the hunt. The paperwork made it official 3 days later. Transfer orders from Tower 7 to roving patrol duties, effective immediately, with assignment to coordinate interagency wilderness monitoring across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. On paper, I was still a regular park ranger with expanded responsibilities for checking remote areas and liaising with neighboring jurisdictions. In reality, I'd become the newest member of a task force that hunted something which officially didn't exist. Lewis picked me up from the apartment complex at dawn, his modified F-250 loaded with gear that looked like standard wilderness equipment to casual observation. Extra fuel cans, climbing ropes, camping supplies, and rifle cases that could have belonged to any serious backcountry researcher. Only the ammunition boxes were different, marked with symbols I didn't recognize and sealed with tape that suggested careful handling. We drove to a private range outside Jackson that Louis had been using for training exercises, 40 acres of isolated property owned by a retired federal agent who asked no questions about the specialized rounds that left unusual impact patterns on steel targets. The range featured multiple shooting positions at various distances, plus mock-ups of camping scenarios and woodland environments where we could practice tactical movement. "First lesson," Louis said, handing me a rifle that looked similar to his but lighter in construction. "The creature's hide is almost impervious to standard ammunition. Regular bullets bounce off or make shallow wounds that heal within hours. These rounds are different." He showed me cartridges that appeared normal at first glance but revealed strange details under closer examination. The bullets were made from some kind of composite material that had been treated with chemicals I couldn't identify, and the brass casings carried markings that looked like they'd been etched rather than stamped. "Dr. Chen spent 2 years developing this ammunition," Louis explained, loading 5 rounds into the rifle's magazine. "Combination of rare earth metals and chemical compounds that react specifically to the creature's biology. It won't kill the thing, but it causes enough damage to make it retreat and reconsider its hunting ground." I spent the first week learning to handle the modified rifle, which fired differently than any weapon I'd used before. The recoil was sharper and the muzzle flash was brighter, and the rounds left different residue that required special cleaning procedures. Louis taught me to take apart and maintain the weapon until I could do it blindfolded, pointing out that equipment failure during an encounter meant death. The second week focused on recognizing signs of the creature's presence. Louis had collected photographs and casts of tracks from multiple encounter sites, showing me how to tell real creature sign from natural animal activity or human-made disturbances. The tracks were larger than any known predator, with claw marks that went beyond normal ranges and spacing that suggested the creature walked on its toes. "It's intelligent enough to avoid leaving obvious sign most of the time," Louis said, showing me photographs of barely visible impressions in soft earth. "But when it's hunting actively, it gets less careful about concealment. Fresh kills make it confident, and confidence makes it sloppy." He taught me to identify feeding sign, territorial markings, and the strange scratch patterns the creature left on trees after successful hunts. Some of the photos showed damage to bark that looked almost artistic in its precision, as if the creature was marking territory with deliberate symbols rather than random claw marks. The third week covered psychological conditioning, which turned out to be the hardest part of the training. Louis made me watch video footage from previous encounters, recordings captured by task force members during creature sightings in Montana, Colorado, and Washington. The videos were grainy and shaky, but they showed enough detail to prepare me for the creature's impossible movements and wrong proportions. "The mind wants to rationalize what it's seeing," Louis explained, pausing a recording that showed something pale moving between trees with fluid motion that hurt to watch. "Your brain will try to make sense of the creature by categorizing it as a known animal or a person in costume. Fighting those instincts is crucial to survival." He made me practice describing the creature from memory until I could give accurate details without hesitation. Height, approximate weight, distinctive features, movement patterns, and behavioral characteristics that might predict its next actions. The psychological training included stress exercises, where I had to maintain focus while Louis played recordings of the creature's voice mimicry, teaching me to ignore the emotional impact of hearing words spoken by something that wasn't human. During our 4th week of preparation, Louis showed me personnel files for the other task force members. 8 people spread across 7 states, each with specialized skills that contributed to tracking and containing the creature's activities. Dr. Sarah Chen at the University of Montana served as the team's researcher and ammunition developer, while FBI agents Jennifer Walsh and Mark Stevens provided federal resources and access to missing persons databases. "Resources are always limited," Louis said, reviewing incident reports from the past year. "We operate on a shoestring budget with equipment that's technically borrowed from various agencies. Most of our intelligence comes from monitoring missing persons reports and cross-referencing them with environmental factors that suggest creature activity." The task force tracked patterns across multiple states, looking for clusters of disappearances in remote areas that shared geographic or seasonal characteristics. They'd identified hunting cycles that lasted between 6 and 12 weeks, followed by dormancy periods when the creature seemed to disappear entirely before emerging somewhere new. Louis explained that their success rate was mixed at best. Sometimes they arrived at hunting grounds early enough to wound the creature and force it to relocate before establishing a significant body count. Other times they found crime scenes days or weeks after the fact, documenting evidence while local authorities classified the deaths as animal attacks or accidents. "We've prevented maybe 30 kills over the past 3 years, Louis said, his tone carrying the weight of lives saved and lives lost. "But for every person we save, there's another victim in an area we didn't monitor closely enough or didn't reach in time." By the end of our training period, I understood why only 8 people knew the truth about what was hunting in America's wilderness areas. The knowledge was too heavy for most people to carry, and the work required skills and mental toughness that ruled out most potential candidates. You had to be willing to hunt something impossible while keeping up the act that you were just doing routine Park Service duties. Louis got the call on a Thursday morning while we were cleaning rifles after target practice. Dr. Chen had been watching reports from Glacier National Park and spotted a pattern that matched the creature's previous hunting behavior. 3 missing persons in the past 10 days, all solo hikers or small groups in remote backcountry areas. The disappearances were grouped around the same drainage system, and park rangers had reported unusual animal behavior in the region. "It's moved faster than we expected," Louis said, studying the incident map Dr. Chen had transmitted. "Usually takes 2 to 3 weeks to establish a new hunting ground, but it's already selecting targets in Glacier." The missing persons included a solo photographer who'd been documenting wildlife near Hidden Lake, a couple from Seattle who'd been backpacking the Continental Divide Trail, and a local fishing guide who knew the area well enough that getting lost was unlikely. All 3 cases shared the same characteristics as previous creature attacks: experienced outdoors people who'd vanished without trace in areas they should have been able to navigate safely. "We leave tomorrow," Louis said, folding the map and checking his gear list. "Drive up to West Glacier and start tracking from the last confirmed sighting locations. If we're lucky, we can wound it enough to make it move on before it kills anyone else." I spent that evening loading my gear into Louis's truck, checking my modified rifle one last time and making sure my ammunition was properly secured. The weapon felt known now after weeks of training, and I understood its capabilities and limitations well enough to use it effectively. More importantly, I developed the psychological conditioning needed to function when confronting something that broke every natural law I'd been taught to believe. The drive to Glacier would take 6 hours, giving us time to review intelligence reports and plan our initial search strategy. Dr. Chen had identified 3 areas where the missing persons had last been seen, forming a triangle around Hidden Lake that suggested the creature was hunting from a central base location. As Louis secured the last of our gear in the truck bed, I felt a strange combination of fear and anticipation. that reminded me of the night I'd climbed down from Tower 7 to investigate Tyler's scream. The difference was that now I had the knowledge and tools needed to fight back, plus a partner who'd been hunting the creature for 3 years. "Ready?" Lewis asked, settling into the driver's seat and starting the engine. I checked my gear bag one more time, making sure everything was organized and easy to reach. Changed rifle, special ammunition, radio equipment, and the mental preparation needed to face something that wore human faces like masks. 4 weeks of hard training had changed me from a traumatized survivor into someone ready to hunt the monster that had killed Tyler Garcia. "Ready," I said, and meant it. The hunt was about to begin.